The causes of the American Civil War are complicated and many, while the most common answer is slavery. The truth is that there were several major factors that combined to create the perfect storm that resulted in the secession crisis of 1860 to 1861. In fact, it was even the first time that a group of Southern states had considered leaving the Union over the institution of slavery. But in this video we are going to look at some of the other major issues that were plaguing the country and how they, along with slavery, created the perfect storm that resulted in the start of the Civil War. And you definitely don't want to miss the bonus material at the end of this video. It's one of the most shocking things about the Civil War era that most people don't know about. It was the night of November 21st, 1860, when a group of South Carolina leaders met in secret in the old State House in Columbia. They weren't aware of it, but this building was actually where the first shots of the Civil War would be fired 4 months later. These men were part of a delegation sent by the South Carolina legislature to inform the United States that their state was seceding from the Union. The delegation consisted of John C. Calhoun, the younger brother of Vice President John C. Calhoun, along with Henry M. Dewey's and J. L. M. Agar. Their mission was to notify officials of the Ordinance of Secession, which declared South Carolina's withdrawal from the Union, which had been passed 2 days earlier by the South Carolina Convention. Their first stop was Fort Moultrie, on Sullivan's Island in Charleston Harbor. There they delivered the secession ordinance to Major Robert Anderson, the U.S. Army officer in charge of the fort. This would be the last official notification given to the federal government before the start of the Civil War. The delegation then went on to Fort Sumter, located in the same harbor. But the men in charge there refused to accept the document. The secession crisis had come to a head when South Carolina voted to leave the Union. The immediate cause of this was the election of Abraham Lincoln as president, who ran on an anti-slavery platform. While Lincoln himself was not an abolitionist and had no intention of interfering with slavery in the South, the mere presence of a Republican in the White House was enough to send Southerners into a panic. After all, the Republican Party had been formed for the sole purpose of opposing the expansion of slavery into new territories, and the Southerners were worried that it wouldn't be long until the federal government would begin to meddle in the institution of slavery itself. But while the immediate cause may have been Lincoln's election, the underlying issue was decades in the making. In order to understand why the Southern states seceded from the Union, we must first understand what the nullification crisis was. In the years leading up to the Civil War, there was a growing divide between the Northern and Southern states. The North had become more industrialized and urbanized, while the South remained primarily agricultural. This difference in economic development led to a difference in values and interests, which made compromise on issues like slavery increasingly difficult. One of the first major issues to cause tension was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This agreement admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state in order to keep the balance of power between the two sides. However, it also prohibited slavery north of the 36° 30-minute parallel, which angered the South because it limited their ability to expand slavery into new territories. Another major flashpoint was the Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state and strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act. This only made the South more determined to protect slavery, as they saw the federal government as being hostile to their way of life. Finally, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed for popular sovereignty to decide the issue of slavery in these new territories, only increased the sectional tensions. This led to violence between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups in Kansas, known as Bleeding Kansas. By the time the 1860s rolled around, the South felt that their way of life was under constant attack from the federal government, and that slavery was in serious danger. The nullification crisis came to a head in 1832, when South Carolina attempted to nullify or cancel the 1832 tariff, which they saw as being unfair to the South. They argued that since the federal government was dominated by the more populous northern states, the interests of the South were being ignored. This led to a showdown between South Carolina and the federal government, with President Andrew Jackson threatening to use military force to collect the tariffs. Ultimately, the crisis was averted when a compromise was reached, but it revealed the deep-seated resentment that many Southerners felt towards the federal government. For many years afterwards, Southerners continued to argue that the federal government had no right to interfere with slavery, and that states had the right to nullify any federal laws that they deemed unconstitutional. This debate would eventually lead to the secession crisis of 1860–61 and the start of the Civil War. Another major factor contributing to the start of the Civil War was the rise of states' rights. This was the idea that states had the right to govern themselves, and that the federal government had very limited powers. Southerners believed that this was essential to protect slavery, because if the federal government became too powerful, it could easily outlaw slavery. They argued that if the federal government had the right to interfere with slavery in one state, then it could do the same in any other state. Therefore, each state should have the right to decide for itself whether or not to allow slavery. But states' rights wasn't just about protecting slavery. It was also about protecting the interests of the South in general. Southerners felt that the federal government was dominated by the North and that their interests were being ignored. For example, the South was largely rural and agricultural, while the North was more industrial and commercial. This meant that the North was much more connected to the national and international economy and therefore had more influence over the federal government. Southerners felt that they were being left out of important decisions that affected their way of life, and that the federal government was becoming too powerful. They began to argue that the United States was really a collection of sovereign states that had joined together for mutual protection, and that the central government had very limited powers. If the federal government overstepped its bounds, then the states had the right to resist. This culminated in the nullification crisis of 1832, when South Carolina attempted to nullify a federal tariff that they saw as being unfair to the South. While the crisis was ultimately averted, it revealed the deep-seated resentment that many Southerners felt towards the federal government. This would eventually boil over during the secession crisis of 1860–61, when Southern states began to secede from the Union. However, there is another major factor that has been largely forgotten, and that is the role that the Democratic Party played in starting the Civil War. As the 1860 presidential election approached, it became clear that the Democratic Party was deeply divided over the issue of slavery. The northern and southern wings of the party had very different views on how to handle the issue, and it seemed unlikely that they would be able to compromise. In the end, the Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas of Illinois for president. Douglas was a pro-slavery Democrat who supported the Popular Sovereignty of Kansas-Nebraska Act. This enraged the Southern Democrats, who felt that he was not doing enough to protect slavery. Many Southern states refused to seat their Democratic electors and instead formed their own party, the Confederate Democrats. This only served to further divide the country and make compromise even more difficult. When Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, won the election, it was only by a small margin, but the result was a disaster for the Democrats. The party was shattered, and the country was more divided than ever. This contributed to the secession crisis of 1860–61 and ultimately led to the start of the Civil War. Now, if you want to learn more about how the war started, check out the video on my channel. But don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next exciting episode.